The Haymeadow, Day 7. John stopped and raised the rifle. For a second, everything hung still. The coyote looking at him, holding the jerking lamb who's bleeding for its mother. The horse stopped, little jets of steam from John's breath in the cool night air, and he almost didn't shoot. It was beautiful, too beautiful to end. There would be a crash, and then an end to the coyote, an end to the animal standing there, in some way that bothered him, to end an animal, and the life. But he would shoot, and he knew it. If he did not end the coyote would end the lamb. It was that choice. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle was thundering, enormously loud in the night. Spud jumped sideways, and in the glare from the fireball coming out of the end of the gun, John saw that he had held right. He could not see the sights of the rifle, but his father had told him to always hold low at night, that people tended to shoot over things in the dark, and John had held on the low edge of the coyote's chest. The coyote had been hit in the center of the chest and was dead instantly, but it wasn't over. In the half second before John squeezed the trigger, the lamb had pulled, and the coyote had pulled back, and the lamb had been yanked around in front of the coyote. The bullet had gone through the neck of the lamb before killing the coyote, and had flopped down on top of the dead coyote. No. John dismounted and ran to the bodies, hoping that it hadn't been as bad as it seemed, that maybe the lamb was just stunned, but it was dead. He pulled the lamb from the coyote, carried it off to the side. The mother nudged it with her nose and tried to get it up, bleeding in small noises. "I'm sorry," John said. "I didn't mean it." Stupid, he thought, stupid. To hesitate. It was the hesitation that had caused the trouble. That half of a second of hold let the lamb come around, but he knew it was more. It was all of it. It was the gun, the killing that caused it. It was wrong, felt wrong, but there was no way around it. If the sheep were to live, the coyotes had to die. It was like a law in mathematics. Sheep and coyotes could not be together. He took the rope from his saddle and looped the noose around the coyote's neck and used Spud, who was half spooky, to be dragging a dead coyote around in the dark, to pull the body of the coyote off into the dark brush and then in a large circle around the herd. Some ranchers hung bodies of coyotes on fence posts and let them mummify there, and swore that it helped keep others away. John couldn't bring himself to leave the body around, but he thought the dead smell might help, and after he'd circled the entire herd, he pulled the body into some brush and buried it in a shallow trench, covering it with sticks and rocks. He carried the body of the lamb off, heeling Spud in a run to leave the following ewe behind, and buried it on the far side of the stream bed in some rocks. The coyotes would get it, he knew, but the rocks might keep them away for a time. Then he moved back to the herd. He rode around them twice slowly and found it to his surprise that all the coyotes had gone, vanished. He thought they would stay even with one gone, but apparently the sound of the rifle had done the trick. After the second round, he sat still for a time, watching the sheep in the moonlight. It's always been like this, he thought. For so long, nobody can really remember there have been people watching sheep and protecting them, just like this, in the moonlight. It was in the Bible, the whole thing about Christmas. That night there were shepherds watching their sheep close to 2,000 years ago. The same moon, the same stars, the same kind of animal. He wondered if they had dogs, and thought they must have. They couldn't have worked sheep without dogs, he thought. They wondered if they had dogs, why dogs hadn't come into the story of Christmas. That whole business should have dogs in it. He was dozing before he knew it, sitting in the saddle asleep, the rifle across his lap, Spud's head hanging down while he caught a nap as well. John awakened some time later. He had no idea how long he'd slept. It was still dark, and the sheep were still bedded down, and the dogs were still taking care of things, and the coyotes were still gone. He wiggled the reins to awaken Spud, who snapped his head up as if surprised to find he was standing with somebody on his back. John guided him quietly around the herd, back to the camp where he unsaddled and picketed Spud in case he needed him. Then he crawled in his bag, put the rifle close by, and lay back to count stars until he was asleep again, which took less than 30 seconds. And the last thing he thought was that it's always been like this, always just this way. Chapter 20. Days went by. On the second day after he shot the coyote, John found a long, dry willow stick and started carving notches, one for each day. There had been a calendar in the wagon. Tink had put it on the wall. It showed a pretty blonde girl holding a horse by the bridle, chewing on a piece of straw, and it was dated 1959. So it wouldn't have been accurate, and it didn't matter anyway, since the water had taken it on downstream forever. He didn't count the days so much as he wanted to keep track of how many he was spending in the camp, and when he had 15 days cut in the stick, he stopped one morning and realized that he didn't mind it. None of it. He didn't mind being alone, or not alone, but with the dogs and the sheep in the mountains, as Tink would say it. He had at first missed sound, voices, talking, other people, but it wore away in some manner, and now he didn't mind so much. Birds sang in the morning, the sound of the water running by the creek was almost like music, and he found himself listening more, hearing more. It was almost as if he was waiting to hear something new, waiting to see something different, and things had definitely changed around the camp. He imagined himself to be his great-grandfather, or how he thought the old man must have been, and he tried to do everything the way he thought the old man would have done it. When he did something, he did it to last, and did it right. He set the wagon up well away from the stream, even farther than he had it when he first pulled it out of the water, and he put rocks under the wheels so it couldn't move. He relashed the tarp to the wagon top, stretched it out taut, and tied it so the wind couldn't come through. The inside of the wagon had been a shambles. The water had gutted it, taking even the iron stove nearly out of the door. He found all the parts and used a smooth stone to pound the worst dents out of the chimney, and by the third night he had a cheerful fire going inside to cut the chill of the night air. The lantern had been tangled in the tarp and was not broken, and the 5-gallon container of kerosene had been caught up on a snag by the handle, so he had plenty of light. Within a week, the way inside of the wagon looked almost orderly. The food was stacked in neat rows, still by guess, because all the labels were gone, and the bunk was back in place with the mattress dried, the sleeping bag in a neat roll, unless he was airing it outside or getting ready to sleep. That at night the rifle was next to the bed, though the coyotes had not returned, and the last thing he did before going to bed was collect dry kindling, small dry sticks of pine or aspen from the stand of trees among the stream, to make a fire in the morning. These he would put beneath the bed, and the first thing in the morning he would reach over, still inside the bag, put the wood in the stove over a small pile of shavings, light the fire, and heat coffee in a saucepan to have when he got up. Coffee. He smiled when he thought of it. It wasn't real coffee, but hot water with a small bit of instant coffee in it, just for color and a tiny amount of flavor. He didn't like it, didn't really even want it, and certainly didn't need it, but it fit the mornings in some way. So he would put his feet down in his boots and take his cup of coffee to the door and sit on the steps and watch the morning start. Probably, he thought one morning, just like Tink, and he worried that he was becoming a 14-year-old old man. It stayed in his mind for a couple days, but work soon took its place, and there was plenty of work. The dogs could herd the sheep and run the herd, but when problems occurred, they came to John. The rocks tore their feet up at first. It wasn't that there were major wounds, not after the first time, but their feet would get scuffed and rescuffed in the sharp shale on the sides of the valley until they seemed to be running on raw hamburger. There was no way to heal them while they were running, and no way they would stay in camp unless they were forced to stay. What he finally did was work a roster, and 2 dogs would work the herd, a male and a female working in teams, while he tied the other 2 to the wagon with bits of rope. He would rub ointment on the feet of the 2 who were resting by the wagon. They hated it and wanted to be with the herd, and worked to switch dogs every 2 days. Their feet healed amazingly fast, and by the second day they were tough and pliable enough to run, which meant the sheep had to be herded by only 2 dogs. Sheep, he thought, lived up to the reputation of not being terribly smart. 2 dogs were not enough to move them when the grass began to get chewed down in a particular spot, which took only hours. The outside edges of the flock would move, but that often meant that the inside area would only have pre-chewed grass to nibble on, and it wasn't as good as the fresh, longer grass. And they wouldn't move on their own, but would just stay in the center of the herd eating the poor grass, and so they had to be moved. But 2 dogs couldn't quite get it done. The sheep would start to move, then filter back around the dogs and go to nibbling again. John would take Speck or Spud, whichever horse was on duty that day, and ride up to help the dogs. He would work back and forth across the rear of the herd and yell and wave his arms to get them going. Ha, ha! He made a low, guttural sound, almost a bark, and by the 10th day he noticed that the sheep were maybe a little smarter than he had thought. They watched him, and if they saw him riding up from the wagon and the dogs started to move them, they would take off on their own before John actually rode close enough to make them move. The next time he tried it, he just saddled the horse and climbed into the saddle and yelled, "Ha!" without even leaving the camp area. The sheep moved or started to move, and the dogs kept them going until they were all in the new grass. And the day after that John didn't saddle up, but just walked to the edge of camp and waved his arms and yelled, and it worked. They looked like a huge gray carpet sliding sideways. Ha, ha! And they slid sideways on the side of the valley wall, fully half a mile from John, and then Billy and Jenny, the 2 dogs working the herd, kept them moving until nearly all the sheep were in new grass. Like magic, John said. 4 days later, he noticed that they started to move before he yelled, and he realized that they were responding to his arm movements. The next morning, when it was time to move them to new grass, he merely walked to the side of camp, faced the sheep, and waved his arm. Over they went, 6,000 sheep and lambs, one wave. Tink must have known this, he said, watching them move, and he never said a word. There were many things his father, Collie or Tink, had not told him. It wasn't that they were holding back on him so much as he hadn't asked, and they might not have known how to say things if he had asked. Everything was so beautiful, and it seemed to not be real, almost a movie. He had always had what he called pretty country around him. Raised on the barren ranch made it automatic, but it was different here. Down on the ranch there was outside interference. Man-made things were always around, and he liked them and thought some of them were nice to look at. His saddle, for instance, something about the deep, rich brown of the oiled leather made it seem that he could see down inside it. But here it was all clean, clear, just beauty. The mountains rose on both sides, and at the far end of the valley just shot up. Always looked different. He looked at them for 10 minutes, looked down and take a step, take a breath and look down. Look again, and they were all different, all new. Clouds, high giants of white slashing storms. They were always new and changed while he watched, and their beauty matched the mountains, matched all of it. By the end of 3 weeks, things had reversed, and he decided one afternoon to try and find what wasn't beautiful. He was sitting on the side of the stream and had his pants rolled up and his bare feet in the water, and he looked around and thought of the last 3 weeks and tried to think of something that wasn't beautiful, and he couldn't. Maybe the coyotes, the one that grabbed the lamb, but that was part of it as well, part of the beauty, even that. His toes? He looked down at his toes and smiled and nodded. His big toes were ugly, really ugly. In all of this, he thought, in all of the country, it's my big toes. I've got the ugliest big toes in the world. He wiggled them and slammed his feet together like a seal, flapping its flippers, and lay back and laughed until Jenny and Pete were tied to the wagon for their foot-off day, looked at him and whined, thinking he was crazy. It's my toes, he said, turning to her. Pete wagged his tail, but Jenny studied his face. They're ugly. Man, I've got ugly toes. And of course he thought they didn't get it. Dogs don't think about ugly toes. And that set him off again, and for the rest of the day, every time he looked down and saw his boots, he would think of his toes and smile. That night, the bear hit, and he didn't think he would ever smile again. Chapter 21. He had no idea what it was when he heard the noise and rolled out of the bunk. He was ready now, always ready to hit the ground running. His feet dropped into the tops of his boots, and he pulled them on. He didn't take time for socks, and his left hand automatically grabbed the rifle, and he was at the door and outside before his mind really had time to kick into gear. There was no moon, and it was the middle of the night. Flashlight, he thought. I should have a flashlight. He thought momentarily of taking time to light the lantern, but decided it would take too long. Noise. Something had awakened him. What? There. It was high in the herd. His eyes were already accustomed to the darkness, and in the faint light provided by the stars, he could see the sheep up on the side of the valley. Something was in them. They were scattering and running in all directions, and he thought for a moment it was the coyotes, that they had come back. Then he heard a new sound, a bellowed growl, very deep, guttural, almost human, if a human could get low enough. On top of the growl, he heard a scream of pain from one of the dogs, and he was on spec and riding, bareback, the rifle in one hand and his other tangled in the mane to hang on. He didn't have time to bridle her and steered with his knees at first, but she probably knew better than he did where she had to go, and inside 3 leaps, she was moving at a lined-out full gallop. John let himself move with her, felt her slide over the ground. It was too dark to see anything but shapes. The light color of the wool on the sheep made them relatively easy to see, and the white patches on the dogs made them show a bit. He saw them running, moving back and forth, trying to get at something, but whatever it was, it did not show until he was nearly upon it. It was a black bear, still down on all fours, swinging around to hit at the dogs. There were 3 dogs up and trying to dash in and snap the bear on the flank. One dog was down and off to the side. John could see it against the ground. There were dead sheep everywhere. He didn't count, didn't even think of it, but they were scattered around and in some cases lying on top of another. Everything happened at once, not just seemed to. Everything happened exactly at the same time. Speck smelled, saw, heard, and recognized the bear just as 2 more leaps would have taken her right on top of it. She turned sideways, didn't pivot, but suddenly went from a horse racing one direction to a horse racing another. It was too fast for John. He had raised the rifle, holding on the center of the black mass, a darker place in the dark night, and Speck turned just as he squeezed the trigger, still at a full run. The gun was unbelievably loud, cracked the night open in a flash sound. He shot at least a foot wide at the bear. Without a saddle, he couldn't stay on, and as she turned he fired, he was at the same instant alone in the air, floating, it seemed forever. He was heading directly for the bear. He had time for thoughts. The rifle, he thought. If I could work the lever and maybe get the barrel down, I could get another shot in before it was too late. The thought came, hung as he hung in the air, and ended as he landed a spread eagle full on top of the bear. Everything ended when he landed on the bear. He had seen them before, seen them in the mountains, and knew they could take a terrible toll of sheep. But he always thought of them as almost cute, like pets, and slow and plodding. He could not believe how fast this bear moved. He wasn't a large bear, perhaps 300 pounds, but he was a very mad bear. And all he wanted was a few sheep and dogs had come from all directions, snapping at him. And then a horse came out of the night and nearly ran over him, and somebody shot at him, and then that same somebody flew through the air and landed on him. He seemed to turn inside his skin, shifted beneath John, rolled and came to his back legs just as John landed, half on his feet. The bear swung sideways with its right paw, one sweeping hook, and it caught John on the left shoulder. Oof! He'd never been hit so hard. Even getting kicked by a horse in the stomach had not been this hard. He almost literally flew sideways, and all still at once, almost at once. Off the horse, the rifle shot onto the bear, knocked sideways all in less than a second. A ball, he thought. He'll come after me, try to finish me, roll on a ball and try to get through it. But the bear didn't come, except for Peg, who was on the ground. The dogs were still there, and when he rose, he hit John. To hit John, they came in on him. Billy, a mouthful of rump, tore hair out and went back in. Pete and Jenny took the sides as the bear wheeled to get one. Another came in, snapping to dance out, and in the spinning to get one dog and then another, the bear forgot John and the sheep. He lowered and backed away, cuffing at the dogs until he could detach from everything, and then he moved off into the darkness and was gone. He left carnage. Dead sheep were everywhere. Peg was down and John was driven into the ground against a small hummock of dirt. Like a fence post, he thought, or tried to think of. He drove me in like a fence post. He couldn't believe the bear was gone, couldn't believe he was still alive, couldn't believe his brain still worked. It was like getting hit by a car, he thought. A car moving about 60. Just wham, and I'm gone. He was on his right side, his face smeared into the dirt, and he rolled onto his back. There was a numbing jolt from his left shoulder, and it seemed to pop, and he realized the blow had partially dislocated it, and he moved it back into position when he rolled. He wanted to scream. It felt like someone had driven a spike into his shoulder joint. John lay on his back for a moment, his breath coming in quick pants while the pain rose and fell and finally dropped enough so he could think straight again. He had been certain the bear would come at him, take him, and he was surprised when it didn't. John rolled forward, grabbed his shoulder, and held it in place. Speck had gone off a bit and was standing. He could just see her in the darkness. Peg, he thought. Peg was down. It was Peg. He rose to his knees, stood, the gun. He needed to find the rifle. The bear might still be there, waiting to run over him. His legs were rubbery, but they worked, and he walked back to where he'd come off the horse. The rifle was there, but it took some seeing, and he had to lean to finally find it in the dark grass. He picked it up, worked the lever. There was some sand in it, and it grated, and put a fresh shell in the chamber. Now Peg. He moved to where she was down. The other dogs had gone back to the herd, but several sheep were around the dog on the ground, smelling it and snorting, stamping their feet. She's dead, he thought. He put his hand to her throat, her chest. It seemed still. No? There. A small movement. She was breathing. Just. Short breaths. Little tight wafts of air. The bear must have hit her, smashed her as he had smashed John. He leaned over Peg and felt her sides, her neck, and then along her back, and while he was there, working his hands down the side of her back, he felt wetness. He couldn't find a wound, but the wetness grew, and he dug deeper into the fur, and then he realized that the wetness was on top of his hand, and that it was dripping down. It was from his shoulder. He was dripping blood from his shoulder where the bear had hit him, and with that knowledge, the wound shock came, and he slowly rolled onto his right side next to Peg and thought, this isn't so bad, not bad at all. And he closed his eyes and decided to take a little nap. Just lie down next to Peg here, he thought, and take a small nap. It's been such a long day, and I'm so tired, so tired, so tired.
Chapter 22. Whining. Some whining in his ear. No, not quite. Next to him, a small whine, tiny whimpers. He opened his eyes, and it was still dark. He still held the rifle in his right hand, although it was twisted and jammed into the ground, and he was on his back. How long? Minutes? Hours? Not too long, he thought. Not so very long. The sound was next to him, whimpering, soft whining. Peg. She was there and hurt. Yes, there it was. The memory. He'd been hit and was bleeding out of his shoulder, and he leaned over her, over the dog, and dropped. Peg. He rose. Again the weakness came, but this time he waited, moved more slowly, and he didn't lose consciousness. He was on his knees. When he was on his knees, he reached with his right hand across and felt the shoulder. There was a cut there, but it didn't feel so long or deep. Not as bad as the pain felt. The cloth of his shirt was damp, but the bleeding had stopped. Peg. Again it came, the small sounds. He had to see about her, get her back down to the wagon. Everything on his body worked, but only with terrible slowness. He stood, like an old hinge creaking open, and looked down at Peg. He could see nothing, no marks on her, could only hear her whining. He'd have to drag her some way, make a skid, a travois. There was nothing to use nearby, grass and rocks and dead sheep. Speck was gone, and moved away from the bear smell, so she wouldn't be any use until he could catch her and quiet her down. Maybe not even tonight. All he had was his t-shirt. He took it off and arranged it on the ground next to Peg's back. With one movement, he pulled her onto the spread shirt. She screamed. Easy now, easy. His voice seemed to help, and she settled. He leaned down and tried to pull with both hands on the shirt and skid Peg along the ground, but his left shoulder would not allow him to use his left arm. He tucked the shoulder under his left arm. It would work for that, and used his right hand on the t-shirt and pulled Peg along the ground. It was slow moving. If he moved fast or tried to move fast, the whining increased, and Peg obviously had greater pain. So he had to move carefully, skidding her over the ground, and that was hard because he had to stoop over, and stooping and holding the rifle hurt his shoulder. They'd come close to half a mile, he and Speck, to run into the bear, and it took him the better part of 2 hours to pull Peg on a shirt back to the wagon. Dawn was beginning to bring light as he reached the wagon, but he brought the lantern out just the same, and lighted it and hung it on the side of the wagon. At first he could find no mark on Peg, no blood. He brought the lantern down close to her and could still see nothing, and might not have found it except that his hand brushed her chest as he moved hair to look for blood or a wound. She screamed again, and her head jerked sideways. Inside, he thought. It's inside. He lowered his fingers gently against her ribs, and he felt it. One of the small back ribs, away from the lungs.
at a break. He could actually feel the break. The bear must have swatted her, knocked Peg as it had done to John, and the blow had broken the rib, and there was nothing he could do.